Have you heard of Professor Christopher Gardner?
I think so.
This brings us to a very interesting study that just came out. He's a professor at Stanford, and he was working with the Sonnenbergs. The Sonnenbergs are arguably some of the leading microbiome scientists in the world. And
is that a husband and wife pair? Yeah, I've heard of them.
And they just conducted a really eloquently designed study that took 38 adults, if my memory serves me correct, and randomized them into two groups. And the idea was really to see how fiber affects the microbiome and how fermented foods do. And of course, fermented foods contain probiotics. So the hypothesis was that maybe they improve diversity. And the idea is to test and see if there's a difference between fiber and fermented foods. And this was a 10-week study. Okay. The subjects that were told to increase fiber, they increased their fiber from 20 grams to 40. The subjects in the fermented food group, they were told to eat 6 serves of fermented foods a day. To give you an example, one kombucha was 2 serves. There was sauerkraut, there was kefir, there was some yogurt, there was about 5 or 6 different probiotic-rich fermented foods. And the results of this study were really interesting, because there was some findings that I guess challenged the idea that fiber leads to increased diversity. In the fermented food group, we'll start there, they saw across the board, aggregate increases in microbial diversity and really impressive increases. So a real strong finding and a good reason to add more fermented foods to your diet. They also measured markers of inflammation, and they measured around 200 odd. So a very comprehensive look at inflammatory markers. And they saw that the fermented foods drove down inflammatory proteins, 19 of them specifically. So the introduction of fermented foods was leading to a better immune response and decreasing inflammation in the body. Now, the fiber group, very interesting. There was an individualized response. So if you look at the aggregate, just the average, the fiber group did not see an increase in microbiome diversity. And that's an interesting finding. And you kind of have to dig into the study to make sense of that. And when you dig into the study, and I've spoken with Dr. Gardner about this, there were some individuals who handled the increase in fiber really well, and they saw an increase in diversity. And then there were some who didn't and actually saw an increase in inflammation. And they thought this was really interesting because this finding is kind of in spite of previous understanding. And what they found was when they went back and looked at baseline diversity, the people who didn't respond so great to increasing fiber, they essentially had very poor diversity to begin with. Okay. And so there are a couple of hypotheses from this study. It's not to write off fiber at all. It's just to say that maybe in certain circumstances, jacking your fiber up from 20 grams to 40 grams overnight is not ideal for some people. And perhaps they need tools and strategies to increase their diversity first before they're increasing. Mm-hmm. And so one of the hypotheses is that if your microbiome is really struggling and you don't have diversity, perhaps you have a long history of using antibiotics, for example, and you've been eating a lot of ultra-processed foods and living a very high-stressed life. We know that stress affects the microbiome as well. Then perhaps it could be a better strategy to introduce fermented foods first, increase some diversity, and then start to add more plant diversity and more fiber into the diet when your gut is in a better position to be able to handle it.